هذا تجمعا مرحوما واجعل تفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل فينا يا مولانا بذنوبنا شقيا ولا محروما. اللهم ارحم هذا الجمع، اللهم ارحم هذا الجمع، اللهم ارحم هذا الجمع يا رب العالمين. رب يسر وأعين يا كريم وافتح بالحق إنك الفتاح الأمين يا رب العالمين. بحرمة الفاتحة. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Do you want to make an introduction first?
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, guys. Assalamu alaikum for all you who made it on time. I'm sure people will be joining as this thing. I'm not supposed to be the moderator, but the moderator couldn't make it, so I'm filling in, right? But I want to introduce the Shaykh first. I know him for like 22 years now, when I was a student at Cambridge, right? And the context in which I got to know him was, I was with the Cambridge University Islamic Society. He was the advisor of the Cambridge University Islamic Society, right? And I had to meet him now and then because of the, for you to be registered at Cambridge, you need to have a staff advisor. So he was a staff advisor. And I used to meet him very often, and I used to talk to him about the kind of problems, trials, and tribulations that the student went through at Cambridge. One of the biggest problems that we were facing at that time, which is 20-ish years ago, so now you know how old I am, right? So there was a lot of infighting and doctrinal issues within the students, right? Along the sectarian lines, to the extent that we almost got deregistered. And I used to have long discussions with Shaykh at the time. And then he used to give some advice. And that's how I became close to him. After a while, I wanted to be his student. So I asked, I don't know whether you remember, I asked Shaykh Abdal Hakim, said, look, I would like to be your student, right? Your murid. And he told me something which I hold dear until today, which is, he said, I would rather be your friend, right? So since then, we've been friends. So our relationship is more a friendship relationship, although I do consider him as one of my teachers, right? So I will stop calling you Shaykh. I'll start calling you Abdul Hakim now because of a friend, right? So I can tell you a lot of things about him. You can always go to Wikipedia and find out all the kind of things that he has done. But I'm just going to give you a personal brief on what this man is, right? So even when we were students, he was very much involved in the student welfare. We had problems with the surau, the Cambridge prayer room. We lost it. And then he advised us and helped us get it back. He's been involved on the ground with students ever since, even till now, at Cambridge. He's also been involved in many other fields, especially dealing with people. So he's one of those person who's on the ground rather than, up in the tower of ivory tower, so to speak. So you've set up things like the Muslim Academic Trust, which produces movies, documentaries, books, and stuff like that. And the whole idea is to bring and introduce the world, or at least especially the English-speaking world, to traditional Islam, which was being lost at the moment. Being lost at that moment and still being lost as we speak now. So that's one of the things that he's been involved in. He asked me not to tell his dark secrets, but I don't think this is your dark secret, right? So he was even in Bosnia during the war and post-war to help rebuild the community and stuff like that, and many other places, right? So he's a man of few words, very English and German, right? So a few words, but a lot of action, right? One of the things that we did work on together after I came back to Malaysia was the Cambridge Mosque, right? And he, I would say, is the person who actually built it. I would be very honest, right? Although he doesn't say it, right? He will never say it, or nobody ever admit it. But if it wasn't for him, the Cambridge Mosque would not exist. And the mosque itself has won many awards, international awards, as an eco-friendly mosque, as an inclusive mosque, and all that kind of stuff. So this is the man behind it. And we were involved in helping raise funds for the Cambridge Mosque. And what Abdul Hakim wanted was, he wanted the mosque to be for the people, by the people. So they wanted, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Abdul Hakim, is the people take ownership of the mosque, so to speak, right? And which is why I remember when I was still a student, this was 20 years ago, I did have a look at that site. That site was, I think, was a workshop or a warehouse or something at that time. And it was 20 years, it was a 20-year journey before it became what it is today. So it took a lot of effort, because whenever you involve community and you want the community to drive something, it is something which is not easy, but it takes a lot of time. And he was the person who has got the patience and the fortitude to make that happen, right? The other thing that he does, also you could say by the people, for the people, is the Cambridge Muslim College, right? So that's something that was also built from the ground up. And he's the person behind the Cambridge Muslim College. So I won't talk too much about that. I know he won't mention this, so I have to mention it before I pass it to him. Not only did he develop the syllabus, he got the funding, he got this thing. He got various people involved in the development of the Cambridge Muslim College. And we are hoping today, as a result of this discussion and this conversation we're going to have, that you will also be part of CMC, right, in its development and future directions, so to speak, right? So with that, not too many dark secrets, I hope, okay, right? So with that, without much further ado, I'd like to invite Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad to give his speech.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So I'm going to give a brief conspectus of the story so far, and I hope that there's a future as well as retrospection of our rather small institution in Cambridge, a boutique college perhaps. Hotel managers call small hotels boutique hotels, so it's a kind of helpful euphemism. But against the larger background of some of the thoughts that are still really unresolved in my mind, and perhaps of many others, regarding the place of Islamic pedagogy in the context of a fast-moving, what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, where all narratives are up for grabs or decaying, where minority languages are dying, where people's historic landmarks of identity, of nation, of neighborhood, of narrative, of gender are liquefying and turning into a kind of globalized culture that seems to be united in nothing so much as an absence of fixed landmarks. A difficult context in which to propose any kind of theological and therefore metaphysically realist institution. Perhaps one way of looking at it would be to take a step back and recalling the particular cultural environment which Muslims who read and write in the Western minority situation, I won't say diasporic situation because I don't really feel I'm anybody's diaspora, I am of the West, are confronting is that the Islamic narrative to us appears and has appeared to European Muslim theologians from the time of somebody called Ibn Agueli, who was the first European Muslim theologian in modern times, who worked mostly in France and Egypt before the First World War, and whose books are now being done into English and are still remarkably timely, is that for us Islam appears not as an ancestral, fond repository of identity-forming memories, but rather as a prospect of an alternative episteme that can help us Europeans deal with some of the vacuities left by the departure of traditional narratives. Europe has been the epicenter of many ideological and humanitarian collapses over the last century or so. And it's against that backdrop, the sense of failure, the sense of the crisis-ridden nature of the modern project, that much Islamic theologizing in the Western, and I think particularly the European context, takes place. So a number of authors in the English language in particular, but also in France, Charles-André Gillis, who's one of the leading French authors on Islam, and Abdel Prado in Spain, from a very interesting perspective. And in the United States, people like Michael Sugich, Charles Upton, in Canada, Ingrid Mattson and others have proposed this perhaps to people from majoritarian Islamic countries, novel perspective on Islam, which is that it is not the happy memory of a golden age, aspect of which we hope to keep safe in the liquidity of the modern world, but rather represents something not of the past, but of an imagined future. That is to say that with the collapse of the West's own religious and philosophical systems, now liquidized by late modernity and post-modernity, the end of all narratives, the atomization of human society caused by a hyper-individualism, where man, or woman as well, is made the measure of all things, and where we self-define exclusively as a measure of our autonomy, and hence our imagined source of human dignity, that as an alternative to this, we look for other narratives. And the tradition of European Muslim thought in particular is that which goes back to Ivan Agueli, and people like Gillis and Prado and others are present-day exponents of this, is to see Islam as a sacred civilization with an intact framework for family and social life, with an epistemological basis that balances between the way of the mind and the way of the heart, and perhaps above all, with a set of ritual practices which is uncontaminated by contemporary reform. A widespread movement in the Western churches, appalled by the perceived trivialization of their forms by modernity, is the migration from liberal to conservative, conservative to Catholic, Catholic to trad Catholic to the Society of Pius X, and then into the Orthodox traditions. Why? Because they're disillusioned by what they take to be the dilution of the all-important sacred and numinous traditions by the dead hand, the mediocratizing processes of modernity. And some of those people take the further step into Islam. So the tradition, I guess, from which I am operating is that migration, the crisis of modernity, not really the crisis of Islam, but the crisis of modernity. And that's how many of us Muslims situated in Western universities see things. But then, in the context of Islam, which by the grace of God has retained its theology and its liturgy and its worship and its idea about gender and family life in a more or less intact form, at least in a form that is normatively recoverable, having taken a sigh of relief, because we found this precious lifeboat in the tossing seas of postmodern chaos, we nonetheless recognize that Islamic civilization itself is in a state of chaos, and this is represented in so many levels, including the level of its pedagogic and educational institutions. So if we're trying in our minority situation in a place like Cambridge to design a curriculum that can perpetuate this idea, this realization of Islam as the ship of salvation, the alternative being postmodern chaos, we need to see the extent to which we can be a continuation of traditional Islamic curricula and institutions and madrasas, and the extent to which we have to kind of go it alone and find our own way. Everybody knows the ruinous state of traditional institutions in the Islamic world. I studied at Al-Azhar for a while, which is not exactly what you would expect if you have this Arabian Nights image of smiling, twinkly-eyed, white-bearded sheikhs sitting in a traditional chair and dispensing eternal wisdom. In fact, the reality of Al-Azhar is you go into the lecture room, and it was built in the 1950s in a kind of Soviet style. Half of the windows are broken. You don't like to touch the desk because you get splinters. The lecturer comes in his safari suit, lights up a pungent cigarette before he opens the book, and it's not really what you romantically imagine Islamic education to be like any longer. But the message he produces is still recognizably the story of that civilization. The core of it is there, but the outward forms and the curricula have been sadly and deliberately decayed. Walk outside Al-Azhar University and go down the street called Bain al-Qasrain, and you will see majestic structures on all hands in a state of ruin. There is the great Shaykhun Madrasa, where Ibn Khaldun spent some time. It's ruined. There is the Madrasa of Sultan Qaitbay, one of the most beautiful medieval buildings in the world, and it's ruined. There is the Madrasa of Sultan Qalawun. There is the Madrasa of Qansur al-Ghori, a wonderful building. I used to spend time just sitting there and looking at the beauty of it, even though the custodian was given so little money by the state that he had to pay himself to replace the light bulbs in the building. Ruination, neglect, decadence, uselessness on all hands. Once I was walking down that street with my late father, who at the time was a member of the Royal Fine Arts Commission responsible for advising the Queen and the state on the conservation of ancient buildings. And he was amazed at these wonderful buildings, this miracle. These buildings are some of the most extraordinary aesthetic creations of human history, and saw them kind of in a state of collapse. And he said, in the midst of his amazement, where did those people go? Where did those miracle craftsmen and glassworkers and masons and calligraphers, what happened to them? What's going on? You look at modern Cairo and compare it to that Cairo, and you wonder where they all went. I didn't really have an answer for him. But just as the outward fabric is corrupt and you have 500 empty medieval madrasas all over Cairo, you find that the curriculum is also not what you would really expect of a great world religion and great civilization, interfered with by interfering, uncomprehending, paranoid generals for at least 50 years, if not for longer, and it is a sad, half-remembered recollection of former greatness. So does Islamic education in the West, if you're doing this strange thing of creating a Muslim institution in the city of Newton and Stephen Hawking and Darwin and so forth, and Crick and Watson, putting an Islamic college there, which is a civilizationally quite startling thing to attempt, does it mean that you reconnect with what's left of the ruin of Islamic civilization, or do you have to do something new? And the problem is redoubled by the fact that even though there is still a curriculum of Islamic education, you can go to Cairo and you can still learn Sharia with people who know what they're talking about. You can still learn kalam and logic and Arabic grammar. There's another half of Islamic pedagogy which is almost outside people's horizon of recollection, which is that if you go to the Madrasa of Sultan Shaykhun, this wonderful ruined building, unfortunately, the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, we have one of the beautiful glass lamps from that mosque, which somehow, after 600 years, is still intact. Just a little relic of the majesty that that building must have been when the students were on the beautiful carpets studying texts, and it was very impressive civilizationally. Across the road from his madrasa, there is the Khanaqah of Sultan Shaykhun. People nowadays remember what a madrasa was. A khanaqah is more remote. Even though in medieval Cairo and medieval everywhere, everybody knew that there was a place where you studied the formal outward disciplines of the religion, your fiqh and your tafsir and your hadith and your... But across the road, there was the place where you learnt the sciences of the heart. The sciences of actually having the right intention when you start to study. So you find that people like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, maybe the best-known scholar who ever taught in Cairo, the greatest commentator on Sahih al-Bukhari, actually did most of his work in a khanaqah and not in a madrasa. The two were symbiotic. Where are they? Is there a single one that's still functioning once there was more than 1,000 in Cairo? No. Because Jamal Abdel Nasser has decided that these were relics of a medieval superstitious past, closed them all down, demolished most of them, and those that survived were turned into party headquarters for his National Democratic Party. And some of them are still that. You can go into those buildings, you can still see the mihrab and the saint's tomb and those traditional things, but there's a guy with an old typewriter and old telephones, and the third world bureaucratic reality has abrogated the sacred past. And this is one of the reasons for the imbalance generally in the Islamic world. And those Islamic educational institutions that have transplanted themselves into the European and the American context, usually of a North Indian, sometimes of a Turkish inspiration, generally bring the exoteric sciences. But what hasn't moved has been those which teach the sciences of the heart. So ilm al-aqwal, but not ilm al-ahwal. Words, but not states. Even though in North India, opposite each of those Darul Ulooms, usually there was the Dargah and the Khanaqah and the Zawiyah, and those places, in some Indian places, are still alive and still thriving. They didn't migrate to our Western context the way the madrasas did. So that's another imbalance. Classical Islamic civilization, for good reasons, kept the study of the heart, the inward subtleties of man, in different institutions to those which were used for the study of what you do with your outward form and with other human beings and with your theological formulation of the divine mystery. The madrasa and the khanaqah are always quite separate, even though they coexisted generally in a harmonious way. So we have this double imbalance. Firstly, we try to connect with the curriculum of the traditional Islamic world, and we find that half of it was designed by apparatchiks with a Soviet education in the 1950s working for Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was semi-literate in Arabic anyway. That's not going to help us. But also the second half of it, the Zawiyah, the Khanaqah, the place where the heart needs to be restored, that doesn't come at all. It doesn't exist, apart from a very few kind of unrepresentative and unusual and sometimes crisis-ridden institutions. So the existing landscape of Islamic pedagogy in the West is really not what one would wish to begin with. And that is even before you begin the process of examining and processing the curriculum in order to make it appropriate and relevant to people brought up in postmodern England. So the challenge is quite formidable. Nonetheless, our demographics are growing. The 2021 census indicated that 6.9% of UK citizens self-identify as Muslim. The number grows by 40% every 10 years. There are more people going to mosques on Fridays than going to Anglican churches on Sundays in England, nationwide. So we describe ourselves as a religious minority. It's a rather strange kind of minority, in that in most British cities we're actually the most active religion now. Such a community, contested by many people on left and on the right in an Islamophobic and anti-immigration and anti-religious secular culture, needs to develop a coherent leadership if it is to stand a chance of explaining itself and surviving. Religious education for us is really a matter of survival. The journalist jabs a microphone in the face of the local imam after a riot, and he has 5 seconds in order to enlighten 10 million people or to confirm their prejudices. What he says has to be the right thing. Unfortunately, most of our imams in Britain don't say the right thing, even when they're coherent in the English language, which is frequently not the case. So we have this large, increasingly educated community with 3,000 mosques that is poorly led by general consensus, sometimes very poorly led. Not so long ago, I attended a nikah ceremony in a mosque in England. Traditional kind of Hanafi, conservative, Deobandi mosque. And because one of the partners to this nikah was a convert, there were some non-Muslims present. Very educated non-Muslims, including quite a feministic lady who edits a major journal. So the Imam, of course, happily grabbed the microphone after the ceremony to give his khutbah al-nikah. And I was wondering how appropriate this would be. And he meandered on a little bit, and it was fairly harmless, and you could just about understand his English. But then he said, in Islam, the wife is the husband's mata'. She is mata' for him, which is what the Quran says. How we translate mata'? And then he thinks, and he says, with a beaming smile, she is her husband's livestock. He's very happy with this. She is livestock for him. And I saw all of the non-Muslim feminists and so forth at the back looking at each other and kind of thinking, whoa, probably our last ever visit to the place of worship of this particular religion. And uncomprehendingly, he had permanently alienated them and blown an opportunity to say something beautiful. Those beautiful Quranic verses about garments for each other and the sakina that descends upon the spouses. There's so much he could have said, but no, it had to be the livestock thing. We lost that battle. Every day there are khutbahs like that from the minbar and elsewhere in which we lose that battle. Not just the non-Muslims, but also the Muslims who really are younger and want something coherent as a reason to believe, rather than just identity and inheritance. It's not a good story. So somehow we need to get something from that broken world of the old madrasas with their amazing curriculum, with 1,000 years of wisdom, that is appropriate to fixing our situation, which is a situation of migrant brokenness and inarticulacy, and of the dark clouds of Islamophobic far-right politics joining the mainstream across the European continent. A challenging situation. So, having taught at the University of Cambridge for more than 20 years now, a city which is a historic centre for religious instruction and the creation of seminaries, 2 Anglican houses, 1 for Catholic ladies, a Methodist training house and so forth, a centre for Orthodox Christian studies, various Lutheran and interfaith things, even a centre for, there's a centre for Baptists. It seemed fairly obvious to me, an unoriginal idea, that Islam should join that landscape in some way. Islam is now, in most British cities, the most widely practiced religion. That is the reality now. But what should it look like? Who would be the teachers? What kind of students should apply? All of this was kind of tabula rasa. And one advantage of being in a minority situation is that you don't have a ministry of something watching you carefully and saying, here's the textbook, this is what your students should say, this is why you shouldn't get involved in this, that, and the other. And in the Muslim world, these things are intensely over-regulated, which tends to suffocate the sense of freedom, autonomy, which the madrasas always enjoyed. Even if a sultan endowed a madrasa, he wouldn't be micromanaging the curriculum. He would trust the scholars to get on with their job. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent creates the great Suleymaniya Madrasa, 8 colleges next to his great mosque. He doesn't appoint inspectors to make sure that they're conforming to Ottoman foreign policy or ethnic inclusion or whatever. He trusts the ulama, gives them the awqaf, and for hundreds of years they produce brilliant ulama and muftis and imams and hafiz, and the system worked. Islam believes in small government and really doesn't believe in government regulation of something like religion. The ruler has no religious authority, even if he's Khalifa. The Khalifa is not a mufti. It's a very surprising religious model. In any case, we have this advantage in the Western world that we can kind of start from scratch, tabula rasa. But we don't want to start from scratch because Islam is the religion of tradition and ijazah, and we want to feel that we are in a living chain of authorization, which is one reason why people like Agueli and his followers and Gilis say Islam is the best place to be religiously for Europeans, because the other things are so decadent and diluted. We want to be part of a tradition, a silsila, ijaza, isnad, and this is really a fundamental part of Islamic education. And I remember one of my first experiences of someone whose roots were in the Nusantara region was a long time ago, when I briefly studied under the late Sheikh Muhammad Yassin al-Fadani, whose name is still a name to conjure with in the Malay world, who was teaching at the time in his little flat in the Hayy al-Andalus in Makkah, where I saw the thing really working. And I still cherish the memory of the brilliance of this living pedagogic situation. Mostly Syrian students, maybe 10 of them, sitting on the floor in this little flat, reading Sahih Muslim. And the Sheikh, who was at that time probably nearly 90, little old Malay guy in the sarong and wispy beard, and he would smoke a shisha during the classes, which had herbs in it. They said it's not tobacco, it's herbs from the mountains of Makkah, what he does. So old and immobile that there were only 2 times when you knew he was still alive. I looked at him and became a little bit worried because he was just there. The first time was when he saw bubbles coming up from the shisha and he breathed a sigh of relief. The second time was when he would suddenly spring to life and he would say, la, because the text that we were reading was just a printed text and we would have to correct it because he had the real text of Sahih Muslim by his memory. And all the Syrian students would correct the errors in the printed text because the real Sahih Muslim is the one that the ulama memorized. And he gave me a 5-volume work, which is just the titles of the books which he was entitled to teach. This is the kind of the miracle of that generation. He had studied in Makkah in the Ottoman times before the fundamentalist thing made all of that difficult. So I actually saw it as a living tradition. How do you incorporate that, which has no equivalent, as far as I can see, in the other religions in the UK that I know of, in the context of Cambridge, postmodern Cambridge, Ministry of Education, the Higher Education Academy, the incredible hyper-regulation of knowledge that exists in liberal democracies where everything is really scrutinized. So we created the Cambridge Muslim College, which to this day, since 2009, I guess we're 15 years old now, has as its primary purpose the choosing of the best imams from the existing madrasa system and their exposure to the modern reality, which is why we're in Cambridge. So they learn about modern philosophy so they can understand why the modern world is the way it is and the basis for the way people think and the derivation of virtue. Where does it all come from? Comparative religion. We take them to the Vatican every year. We had a trip last summer. It's part of the course. So they can meet seminarians and people who are training for the Catholic priesthood who are confronting in some ways analogous issues and problems that young Muslim trainee imams are facing. They learn about science and religion issues, the Big Bang, nanotechnology, neuroscientific reductionism, quantum computing, all of these contemporary issues that are challenging for religion. But we don't give them the Islamic answer. We give them an explanation of the difficulty of the issues and the differences of opinions amongst the scientists, and then a brief exposure to ways in which Muslim thinkers have related to some of these crises. So at least they're literate. So in that sense, we're not a kind of modern-style Islamic university where you're given an exam and you get the right or wrong answer. Instead, the traditional Islamic method is that you are assessed in your competence to understand and to teach a text, which in most cases is a text that proposes a variety of solutions. The fiqh works give you the ikhtilaf, especially the bigger fiqh text. So you become somebody who is a member of the disputational but nonetheless convivial conversation that is the traditional world of the madrasa, not the modern ideological Islam says this or the correct Islamic response is that, which is simply a form of decadence because that's not what our tradition is, but rather to inhabit that diverse discursive space, which in a certain way makes it easier for us to make sense to the ministry and the wider pedagogical world, where they don't really like closed solutions, but where they like people to be introduced to an ongoing environment of research, collaboration, disputation, debate, the life of the seminar, and academic polemic and dispute. The Islamic openness actually fits reasonably well into that world. So we have that course. We also have a BA, which is accredited in Islamic studies, which does do the traditional texts, and most of our students are either Shafi'i or Hanafi, so we focus on those two madhabs. But overall, there's an emphasis on what is called the ma'qul over the manqul. So we do Quran, we do Hadith, and we do the fiqh, but we emphasize quite strongly some of those neglected intellectual traditions. Logic is important for us, modern logic as well as traditional Islamic Aristotelian logic. We also look a lot at the kind of deep kalam arguments, the existence of God, the nature of evil, the relationship between God and creation, the responsibilities of human beings, all of those sort of deep philosophical things looked at through the pretty aqlani rationalizing lens of the late Kalam, post-Taftazani tradition, and we tend to emphasize that a lot. And some of our students go on to do masters in philosophy faculties. They get the bug, rightly or wrongly. They're interested in those big questions. A lot of science and religion issues. Knowledge of Arabic is a precondition for admission. We don't want to spend too much time doing alif, ba, and fa'il wal maf'ul for first years. We want them to be able to hit the ground running. And our third program, and I was happy to see that some people here are actually graduates of this online program, is in Islamic psychotherapy and counseling, which is 1 year, quite intensive online program, which is designed generally for early or mid-career qualified practitioners in mental health, psychologists, psychiatrists, people who are interested either in knowing how Muslims tick because they have Muslim patients, or they're interested in relating the very secular and reductionist materialistic view of brain and cognition that is taught in secular departments of psychiatry to the Islamic understanding of the soul and the spirit and the mystery of consciousness and the transcendence of ethical life. How do those actually coexist? Can they coexist? So that's taught by somebody called Dr. Abdullah Rothman, who pioneered the process with his own teacher, Dr. Malik Badri, who of course was well known here in Malaysia, alas no longer with us. So those are the three key programs, full-time educational courses. On top of that, we have research fellows. And we've actually become the UK's largest hub for postdocs and higher research in Islamic studies. So we have people like Professor Yassine Dutton, who used to be at the University of Edinburgh, who has a career publishing on Maliki fiqh and the Muwatta. We have somebody called Professor Razia Sultanova, formerly of the Conservatoire in Moscow. She's of Uzbek heritage, who has about 25 books on Islamic ritual, particularly female ritual, and on Islamic musical traditions. And she now has a grant from the British Academy, which is the country's highest grant-making body, to pursue her research with us. She spends a lot of time teaching in Prague, but she's a globetrotter, but her office is at CMC. We have somebody called Professor Claire Gallienne, who's a French Muslim, a hijab refugee, having converted to Islam mid-career in France, who works, she's doing her second PhD at the moment, but whose new book, which is coming out later this month actually, is on 18th century British scholarship of Arabic and the Islamic world. She's done some very interesting work in the archives, particularly in Oxford. So we've got a wide range of people who are doing research in Islamic studies. And we also, because we're a recognized center for this, have a number of other activities, such as most recently, we are the UK base for curating something called the St. Andrews Online Encyclopedia of Theology. Some of you may have heard of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a free resource online, which is the best place to go to for in-depth articles on philosophical issues, 30,000 words on Wittgenstein, 30,000 words on ontology. It's heavy philosophy, and it's free. It's a great thing. St Andrews University is the home for a theological equivalent of that, which is also a free resource. So we've posted online the first 13 articles with another 50 that we're preparing for publication, and ultimately we hope to have several hundred Islamic studies articles on that resource, which, because it's free and in the English language and only the best scholars are obviously invited to participate, Muslim scholars, is set to become the principal repository of information, academic information about Islamic religion, which is available worldwide to the Ummah, because if you're in Bangladesh or Kenya or somewhere, you probably can't afford academic journals or monographs, and that inherent structural inequality is abolished by this kind of web-based academic platform. So we're very excited about that, and we've already published some very interesting articles. Ibrahim Harvey's article on Fitra, for instance, which went up recently, is well worth reading, with a long reading list at the end. And of course the advantage of web-based resources is that they can be regularly updated as new publications emerge in the field. So alhamdulillah, we've taken the first baby steps. We're still working on this cross-civilizational pedagogic challenge. And as for the larger challenge, which is how you integrate these formal knowledges with the sciences of the heart, we have a regular majlis of recollection in the college every week. We have students who read some of the classical spiritual texts. But I would say the greatest single challenge for Islamic education in the West at the moment, maybe in some Muslim countries as well, is that there is a place you can go to get a degree in Islamic studies, but the old places where you could go for spiritual training and refinement are very difficult to find. And I think many of the imbalances, the fundamentalist externalizings of Islam in the last few generations in the Islamic world are due to the fact that people no longer have that pedagogy of the heart, and everything just becomes formulaic and an external religious identity. So that we haven't solved yet, although we recognize it as a challenge for the future. In any case, I should shut up now. In silence there is wisdom, says the hadith. But you're all very welcome to come and visit us in Cambridge. People often go to England for whatever purpose. Not in December, I would suggest. It's kind of like living underground. It's dark and wet and deathly, but in the summer it's pleasant. Come and visit us in Cambridge. You'd be very welcome to see the students and enjoy the library. And we have our own campus in the centre of Cambridge, which we actually own, although we're perpetually strapped for cash because we're not supported by any government or any external Islamic movement. We're entirely an independent charity. Come and visit, come and enjoy the atmosphere. It's a nice oasis. It's a kind of laboratory, work in process, but we're always very happy to welcome people from this part of the world who bring some of the fragrance and the blessings of the Islamic world when they come to see us. So please, looking forward to your ziyarah, your visit, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair. I'd like to go into a little bit of housekeeping because normally when we do it at the end, people will be busy wanting to go back, but I think it's something important that we need to share. What you see behind there is the information on the Cambridge Muslim College, who to talk to. Please visit the website. It's an amazing website with a lot of the information that Shaykh Abdal Hakim has shared, including information about the scholars and the type of research that's being done. And we also hope for cross-fertilization between the Western form of Islam, so to speak, and the Eastern form, right? Is Aida here? Aida? Aida is not here. Okay. I'll introduce you to Aida later. So she's the one that has brought Shaykh over. For you to get real information, if you want to do courses, if you want to be a volunteer, or you want to be involved in the Cambridge Muslim College, she's the person to talk to. Maybe later when she comes, I'll introduce you to her. Okay? I'm not going to ask any questions because I'm sure you guys are more than willing and really waiting to ask questions. This is actually an open conversation, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a question. It can be a comment, or it can be a piece of information that you can share that will enrich the conversation that we had today, right? But please try to keep it as short as possible, because I would prefer to have 10 inputs from 10 people rather than 2 inputs from just 2%. So over to you guys. Okay. We have the mic? Maybe someone here? And then the person at the back. Oh, okay.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Shaykh, for that. I have a question. I think it comes from the fact that I just graduated last year from Cambridge, and I did history and politics. And one of the modules I did was politics and religion. I think a big challenge when trying to take a political academic view of Islam is the fact that the academia tends to always be culturally relativist in some point. It's either spatially, in terms of the Occident versus Orientalism, or temporally, right? Whether things in Islam are absolute or are historically contextual. I think the question that I have, just to keep it short, is when, specifically from a political science point of view, is there a border in which we should be mindful of when studying Islam's contributions to politics? And I'm thinking the border from absolute versus contextual. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure that politics is right at the center of our concerns. We're more numinous, I suppose. Metaphysics is our core interest. We are not an Orientalist institution in that we don't occupy an allegedly neutral space in which we perceive the normativities of Eastern cultures for whatever reason. But neither are we paranoid about the Orientalist heritage. Orientalists have often been useful pioneers in understanding important aspects of Islamic civilization. We engage quite positively with much of the contemporary scholarship, which is sometimes explicitly or explicitly against the colonial hierarchies that were supposed to be inherent in the older generation of Orientalists. So, for example, when we study Islamic doctrine, we do recognize that it is fully understood only in the context of the historical circumstances of its emergence, which is not what they do at Al-Azhar, where you study Ash'arism as a kind of ahistorical fact that you perceive in texts in 2 dimensions. We do try to expose the students to the fact that all of the articulations and hermeneutics of the religion are conditioned necessarily by their passage geographically and historically. So in that sense, I suppose we're post-classical. We're not particularly ideological in trying to preserve some ideal Mamluk perfect Islam. We're trying to experiment with various hybridizations of the best of sort of contemporary serious historiography and intellectual history, and taking the modern challenge seriously, but at the same time seeing how that can be juxtaposed with an ongoing fidelity to the Islamic narrative. And I think probably that's what's most unusual or idiosyncratic or perhaps original about what we're trying to do, in that we don't fit in any existing kind of category of what Islamic education should look like. We're not really phobic about anything, which is actually for the Imams program, most of the people who come and teach are actually not Muslims at all. If they want to study a bit about Catholicism, we bring in the bishop or we bring in a theologian. If they want to learn about Darwin, we bring in somebody from the biology department or from the Human Genome Project. There's a lot of resources available in Cambridge, so that we don't cushion or shelter our students from the harsh winds of modernity. We say, well, we're at the front line, this is a challenge, but here are the best people who are aware that there are problems and debates in their own intellectual communities, and it's kind of fun to engage them on the basis of the fact that we have differences of opinion, you have differences of opinion, let's occupy some kind of scholarly common ground. So on that basis, I think we're more of a kind of contemporary Western institution than a traditional madrasa, in that we're opening the paradigm of the students to look at different alternatives. So we don't even have an official aqidah or doctrine or fiqh position. We don't issue fatwas. We're just a space in which a serious conversation can happen at the undergraduate and postgraduate level between Islamic tradition in its diversity and modernity in its diversity. Yeah, so we're quite non-ideological, and we find also that that helps us to gain the trust of the students, because we're not pushing them towards anything. We're just opening their eyes to the confusing diversity of all of the issues.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Thank you very much for this very informative speech. My question is that apart from, I've visited your website, and I believe you're also teaching Islamic educational psychology. I've seen some of your lectures are from Islamic psychology. So my question is that, apart from Islamic studies, do you think that even the English language can be taught with Islamic perspective? And are you interested in coming up with courses on teaching the English language with Islamic perspective? And do you think that's even possible? Thank you very much.
Whether it's possible or not, it's what we have to do. Our students can't be taught in any other language, and we have to reach into some of the most complicated metaphysical, legal, ethical, hermeneutic discussions that are historically on home turf in the Arabic language, and we have to teach them in English. One of the most interesting cultural migrations that's happening at the moment is Islamic categories and concerns are moving out of the traditional Islamic languages and into the very different semantic space of European languages, and the extent to which they're changed or mutilated or perhaps even reinvigorated by that. Something that's interesting to think about. What is a poem written by a Muslim poet who is native to the English language? What is its intrinsic difference to, say, Rumi translated by Nicholson from Persian? It's a different kind of voice, but I think in many ways it's a refreshing and a reinvigorating voice. But it's work in progress. And of course many of the lecturers will prefer to revert to Arabic terminology when they're dealing with key Quranic or even Kalam categories. And I don't see that that's a problem. If you study Judaism in a yeshiva or at Leo Beck College in London, you'll find there's a lot of Hebrew terms. If you study Hindu philosophy, you'll be studying a lot of Sanskrit terms. To insist that everything has to be rendered into some putative Anglo-Saxon equivalent is unnecessary, I think, and perhaps rather ideological. Languages should be left to be themselves, should be allowed to hybridize, appropriate new words. I think that's part of the natural process of the growth of a religious community's episteme in a new linguistic space.
Can I go? Hi. Hi.
You first. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Sheikh. Thank you for your enlightening lecture on what Cambridge Islamic College does. My question's regarding the, like as you mentioned just now, that Islam is a living tradition, right? Yet, over the past few hundred years, we've seen decline of Islamic civilization. Islamic societies have weakened compared to the West. So I guess my question is, and also just want to mention, like Arnold Toynbee mentioned that civilizations die not from outside forces; they usually die from suicide. So I just want to know your opinion on like what is your view of like what happened to Muslim societies and Muslim civilizations and what caused their decline from your perspective? Thanks.
It depends how you measure the vitality of a civilization. You could say that Western civilization, following the postmodern turn, has really collapsed because the traditional concerns of philosophy departments, for instance, are hardly taught at all except as historical curiosities. And that this profound wave of atomistic relativization, the turn to the self, the turn to the subject, has actually drawn a line under the Greek tradition, the Christian tradition, the Kantian tradition. We're now left just with linguistics, really. So I would say the collapse of Western civilization has been more acute than that of Islamic civilization. Because when I went into those classes at Al-Azhar, despite the 500 ruined madrasas outside, and the guy at the desk who was smoking a Cleopatra cigarette while he was giving the class and then talking about football, and it seemed decadent. Nonetheless, the tradition was alive. He really inhabited it. And the students were really hanging on every word. All of these students who are from places like Burundi and Malaysia, who were with me in that Tati lecture room, they actually were part of a continuing, ongoing process of learning. And when they read texts from 1,000 years ago, they felt they were part of that community and those teachers were still speaking to them. So if you're saying the civilization is the religious core of Islamicity, it's still alive, still authentic, I would say, for those who want to listen to it and can put up with the Cairo traffic. You can still find it. If you're looking for Baghdad in the time of Harun al-Rashid, visit Baghdad now and It's either organized crime or fundamentalists or Starbucks or whatever, but it's not. That's the thing you won't find, that Arabian Nights is not there any longer. But even that was just a historical moment, and I'm not terribly pessimistic about the situation, because I see so many people in the West disillusioned with what's called the fatigue of secularity, wondering what is the future of humanity, when the master signifier for all of our history, going back to the Upper Paleolithic, was the sacred. In our generation, it's gone. How sustainable is it? So I was recently watching a YouTube lecture by the leading American feminist Camille Paglia, who is really, actually, like a lot of feminist philosophers, worth listening to, because they have a kind of prophetic anger which is quite good at critiquing existing structures. And she says that she enjoys, as I think she identifies as a transgendered lesbian atheist, so nothing to do with Islamic orthodoxy, she enjoys the fluidity and the transitory nature of our mobile, liquid modernity, and it's the world that she inhabits. But she says, looking at history, such relativistic, post-normative civilizations never survive. That's what happened in the late Roman Empire, and it was overthrown by the German barbarians with horns in their helmets and the kind of clubs in their hands, and Rome fell to those people. And she says the most likely barbarian alternative to the collapsing Western episteme, which she loves, is likely to be the Islamic populations. And that's her prediction. Well, we don't really like to be told that we're like the smelly Germans in the 4th century sacking Rome. We're not really there for that, but it's interesting that there is a sense of the finality of the Western narrative amongst many of their key thinkers, a sense of this fatigue of secularity, as John Gray calls it, and an understanding that there's something new, something with some kind of epistemic rigor and reality is going to take its place. So I see that happening amongst, had several quite gifted English people in Cambridge take their shahadas recently. Last year we registered 205 conversions at the Cambridge Mosque. Every year it goes up. So there's a certain disillusionment, but not on the basis of, I want to discover the mystic East and fly on a carpet with Sinbad over the minarets of Baghdad, and that's what the world of Islam is. They're more realistic than that. They're interested in the ideas rather than the mystic East, which I think is a healthy thing. So if that process can be supported, and we get quite a few converts teaching at the Muslim college, but also studying at the Muslim college, and some of them are very gifted, remarkably gifted, some of them, that generally the young people give me a lot of hope that there will be a reinvigoration of the tradition, not based on a simple mimesis or mindless replication of forms of the past, but on a creative engagement with the usul that actually I think stands a reasonable chance of success in our Western space.
Before you ask your question, those of you guys who are joining us on live stream, you can also post your questions, and maybe we will try to accommodate your questions as well. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. I'm Azlan Shah. I'm visiting Cambridge Muslim College next week, inshallah. Planning to pray Friday prayer, hoping to see you delivering the khutbah, hopefully. My question is, I'm interested with the courses that you mentioned about the psychology, the psycho-spiritual, the one that Shaykh Abdul Hakim and whatnot. So is there a requirement that you must be trained in the secular field first, in psychology or in psychiatry, before you can enroll to that kind of courses, or that is embedded in that course?
Essentially, the course would be very difficult, because Rothman has a PhD in psychiatry and is speaking to the converted, as it were, medical health professionals who are already quite experienced. You'll see the criteria for admission on the website. It's very oversubscribed. We have 27 places. Last year we had more than 200 applicants, because mental health is big business nowadays. Everybody's going crazy, it seems. The doctors are busy in that space. So they tend to be quite selective, and one of the selection criteria is likely to be demonstrable academic experience and background in a related field. Yeah, it's not something you can just jump into.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. It's Amir Ashraf. I have a question regarding your Cambridge Muslim College. How do you see the Istanbul, the Darul Funun in Istanbul, the Istanbul University? It's an attempt to reform the Muslim madrasa education at the advent of modernity. How do you see these models as parallels, or do you see it differently? Or do you view this, we need to reform as the same as the Darul Funun way of reforming the education?
Well, the Darul Funun in the kind of Hamidian period was an attempt not to replace the madrasas, which were still thriving, but rather to create a kind of mediative space where Western Orientalism translated into Ottoman could engage creatively with some of the traditional sciences. It wasn't really intended to be a reformist or a modernizing institution. Following Zia Gökalp and somebody called Mehmet Fuad Köprülü, who became dean of that department following the secular revolution in the 1920s, it did become focused on what they then called ilahiyat, which was divinity, basically a translation of the Western category, attempting to, as it were, reduce Islam to fit a European conception of religion as being about what happened in places of worship, theological arguments, but something like Sharia, for instance, would be excluded from the curriculum. And then it was closed and then reopened, maybe in the 1970s or 1980s or even more recently, as the Ilahiyat faculty of Istanbul University, which has become one of the premier theological schools in modern Turkey, where the curriculum is quite a bit broader, and where they do fiqh and Sharia issues as well, not just kind of personal things for the benefit of provincial muftis, but more general studies of the Sharia from a historical perspective. So it was caught up in the catastrophe of Turkey in the early 20th century, the Balkan Wars, the First World War, the loss of the Arab provinces, the secular revolution, the suppression of public Islam, the banning of worship in Arabic. It was a very extreme time that they went through. But Islam tends to survive such things. I remember once, this is almost unrelated, 40 years ago, visiting the great Shirdar Madrasa in Samarkand, one of the most magnificent buildings in the world, 16th century, when it was the Museum of Atheism. And you saw little Uzbek school children being taken around and shown bad waxworks, showing the mullahs exploiting the masses and taking their money, and the usual kind of Bolshevik propaganda against men of religion. Last time I went, the waxworks had gone. I don't know where they took them, and at least nearby, the madrasa is functioning again, and the old books are back in operation, and the country is coming back to life. So secular ideologies, however fierce and well thought out, tend not to abide when compared to religion, which has a habit of revival. It's the most resilient of all human institutions and states of mind. So in Turkey also, despite a million problems, there has been a massive resuscitation of religious learning, and there's so many new divinity schools and private colleges where you can go to study Islam in various interpretations, when in the late 1920s, early 1930s, there was hardly anything apart from Bursa and the Ankara school and what was left of teaching in Istanbul, and all the madrasas were turned into, the Soleimani madrasa was turned into, I think, a maternity hospital or something. So you had Turkish women giving birth in the rooms that the students used to occupy, and very rigorous secular-minded exclusion of anything sacred. But religion will out. It comes back. It's amazing to see. How are we doing, Yunus?
I've got a question from the live stream. It's from Uthman Mustafa. I would like to know how educational institutions like CMC can help combat Islamophobia in the West, to provide a more truer narrative.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mentioned the anecdote about my friend's wedding in a mosque in England and the catastrophic nikah khutbah that made all the non-Muslims kind of giggle or scowl, and their Islamophobia level probably rose. It might have been 60%, then it became 95%, and they're no doubt over their wine and cheese telling their friends about what they heard in the mosque. So at least it's an exercise in damage limitation. And we find that the kind of trainee reformed imams, as they go out, are much more aware of how to engage with wider society and how to present things. We do media training, for instance. So Roger Moser, who is the former controller of BBC Radio 4 in Cambridge, I think he became the master of Selwyn College, comes over to the college in order to teach our young imams how to deal with journalists. What are the trick questions? How do you not answer the question but make the point that you want to make? Kind of things politicians do, which you have to do when you're dealing with the media. How to avoid falling into traps. So we film them, we give them a difficult question, they respond, and then we play back the recording. We say, you should have done this, you shouldn't have done that, and we give them a certain degree of media training. And they really appreciate that. So on that kind of level, yeah, we push back against Islamophobia. But Islamophobia is a funny kind of thing because this new ideology of anti-Muslim nativism across Europe, it's not really based on a proper philosophy or a theology. It's more just, we don't like foreigners. It's not really very substantive, which means that it's quite volatile. Their electoral performance fluctuates very wildly, often on the basis of economic conditions. So, for instance, with the Cambridge Mosque, when we were building it, we did have the English Defence League coming along and protesting against the building. But we also had a lot of donations for the new mosque from non-Muslim neighbours, dozens of them. They would log onto our website and they'd say, here's my £10, I don't believe in religion, but this is a wonderful thing and we support your community, and there was a lot of that. So people are not intrinsically given to xenophobia and hatred. It's something unnatural to the human soul. Most people just want to relax and get on with their lives and enjoy having neighbours who are a bit different. The Islamophobic thing, if it's not triggered by particular political agendas, because it doesn't have a philosophy behind it, or if it does, it's based on the wildest internet conspiracy theories. Like yesterday I was talking about the Great Replacement theory, which almost 40% of French people say they believe in, which holds that elites, possibly Jewish, possibly Freemasons, possibly aliens, I don't know, the theories are out there, are conspiring in order to replace white European Christians with Muslim immigrants, which is one of the silliest conspiracy theories ever. But in the kind of bubble chamber, strange world of the internet where memes reinforce each other, significant numbers of people can actually buy into these things. We saw a lot of them at the time of COVID, for instance. Odd conspiracy theories about 5G telephone masts making you sneeze. It was strange to see how modern humanity becomes really primitive and gullible when something is repeatedly fired at it on the internet. So something like modern Islamophobia and European nativism and kind of a lot of the religious right in America and kind of the Trumpist phenomenon is an epiphenomenon of the internet and the way in which messages are reinforced and people are not exposed to contrary messages. How you deal with that, I don't know, unless you absolutely pack the internet with Al-Ghazali. If you're going to do that, not easy. If the algorithm is constantly reinforcing your prejudices, how do you break into that? Don't know.
That is a big problem with the internet and the algorithm especially. I've got two questions, but I think they're similar, so I'm just going to read one of them from Farida Idris. By the way, we've got 15 more minutes, Sheikh. In a Muslim world in which Islamic curriculum and pedagogy is tightly regulated by the authorities, what suggestion can you give to change the approach of the curriculum, particularly if there is a need of diversity of knowledge and points of view inevitable, such as multiracial and in a multicultural society? I hope I read that correctly. Yeah. So in terms of diversity and all that, so I mean, you, in a nation, everything is kind of standardized. So how do we this thing, standardization with diversity? How do we?
Well, this is where the internet can actually be useful in certain ways. You can all log on to the website of the Cambridge Muslim College and get the true Islam, you see. Which is the culture of diversity, which is that there's usually more than one answer to a particular question, because we have no Vatican, we have no hierarchy, there's no magisterium. So many of the issues, particularly of fiqh, have always been left relatively open, which some people find confusing, but it's the nature of the religion, really. It's a culture of diversity. Thomas Bauer's recent book, Culture of Ambiguity, is very good in explaining how traditional Islamic scholarship thrives on and likes disputatious difference and doesn't strive for a single unitive view on fiqh or aqidah issues. People need to be reintroduced to the fact that Islam cannot be mediated infallibly by a nation state, but is the ongoing conversations of the global community of scholars, past and present. That's where you find authenticity. I suppose the states have attempted to regulate religion for two reasons. Sometimes because they're afraid of extreme misinterpretations, so they have a security agenda, and sometimes you can understand that. Sometimes also because they want to reinterpret Islam as an ideology of national growth, national identity, progress, science, technology, or whatever, which it may not actually be. So those are two things that one needs to watch out for. But the Islamic tradition is always that the state backs out of any direct intervention in religious discourse, and that's why Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal preferred to be flogged and tortured rather than to accept the fatwa of the Khalifa of the day. This is the tradition of the ulama, is to keep their distance, because they're the representatives of the Muslim population to the Sultan. They are not the Sultan's representative to the Muslim population, which is the case in some of the Caesar or Papist administrations in the Middle East in particular, which can be extremely subversive. In England, we have a theocratic system. The Church of England, the bishops are appointed by the state and they sit in Parliament, and the prayer book is authorised in England by Act of Parliament. But that's not the Islamic model. There's no Islamic ruler ever who's tried to tell people how to pray. It wouldn't last very long if he did. Religion is really kept independent, which is not the journalistic stereotype of Islam as intrinsically theocratic at all. We believe in a small state, and we believe in religion as something independent and prophetically independent, so that it's able to condemn what morally needs to be condemned.
Any questions from? Okay, raise one.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for the insightful lecture, Shaykh. So, as we all know, there's been 1 year since Gaza genocide happening in front of our eyes. And in some ways, it has elevated the consciousness of the Ummah and also the rest of the humanity against Western atrocities and principle and duplicity. Yeah? So there's a saying that goes, let's not waste a crisis. So in this scenario, what else can the Ummah do to further elevate Islamic values against Western and secular principles and teachings?
Well, the hypocrisy of Western elites who for generations have been urging Muslim countries to trade up to Western-originated declarations of universal human rights and the various allied UN institutions, the International Court of Justice, and the various non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch. This is a model of human tolerance and diversity which the West has always urged on the Muslim world. Now we see that where something genocidal is taking place that is awkward for Western elites, they're immediately jumping back and challenging those decisions and saying, well, in this case, it's not really what it appears to be. And that set of double standards and that hypocrisy is kind of evident not just to Muslim people, but generally to people across the world. And actually the South Africans, not a Muslim country, who are leading the charge, the International Court of Justice, in the prosecution. So it is quite revelatory for some more naive colonial souls who think that the West is this kind of paradise on earth that is going to solve everybody's problems. Certainly isn't, and internally doesn't believe that it's that. But is it the case that the Muslim world has effectually and in a united way stood up for justice over Gaza or any other Islam-related issue? What are we doing about Sudan, for instance, or Yemen? There's plenty of crisis and conflict zones. Are we actually going in there and sending our armies to defeat the militias in order to help people to remain in their homes? Well, not really. So I'm not sure that we're in a very strong position to moralize. But at least the veil has dropped from the face of Western intentions. Because if the West's own institutions now, and Human Rights Watch and War on Want and all of the major humanitarian charities are saying that this is genocide, targeting of civilians, drones shooting doctors in the corridors of hospitals, it's there, it's all being recorded. I think that helps to disabuse some people who are a little bit hypnotized by the Eurocentric discourse of the West as the fountainhead of all goodness, so that they can be a little bit more healthily cynical at least. I think a lot of people around the world are gaining that healthy cynicism, which can't be a bad thing.
We've got 9 more minutes. Okay. Okay. We'll just 2 more questions. One from here and one from the person at the back, the sister at the back. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, given that we inhabit the postmodern world in a kind of osmotic way, we've absorbed also the idea that there's a loss of a meta-narrative. So how do you think current and future Muslim scholars can provide a narrative, one that is metaphysically sound and also indigenous to our tradition, to address current issues, for example, the tragedies that we see nowadays, without it evolving into just mere politics or history?
Well, unfortunately, human beings are copycats and they like to go with the flow. And we're all consuming global media, and Hollywood is reshaping the soul of the world with its ideas of human excellence and human villainy. And it is very difficult for most people not to be sheep and to follow the herd. There will always be people who have the independence of mind and a critical gaze that enables them to say that the Hollywood image of ethics is not really what leads to human flourishing. But it may well be that we have to see further disasters in the secular project before most people experience that disillusionment. Climate change is one area where people are wondering about this ideology of endless materialistic competitive growth. The world's resources are finite, human greed is infinite, so at some point there has to be a breakdown. There are other areas where the technological project seems to be threatening us. Quantum computing is something threatening. AI is worrying. AI may apparently develop, and this seems to be the main concern of the scientists in Cambridge who are in that area, may be able to design new biological weapons, for instance, that would be impossible to rectify, something 1,000 times worse than COVID or an infectious cancer or something that could be racially specific, for instance. And AI could certainly help to genetically engineer those existential threats. Family breakdown, the fact we have a ministry of loneliness now in the UK because of the atomizing of our society. Plenty of people are saying that something is really wrong. The population crisis, population's not even replicating itself, which is the most fundamental human function. We have a very negative birth rate in the UK. Korea is even worse. The most common language spoken in the mountains of southern Italy now is Kyrgyz, because the Italians are not having babies. The young people have gone to Germany or somewhere to flip pizzas. The only people who are still in the hills are immigrants from Kyrgyzstan because they know about sheep and goats, and this is looking to some like a replacement. So it's so obviously an unsustainable model, even on its own terms, materialistic terms. It's not working, it's threatening us all, quite apart from nuclear proliferation and what Putin might do, and new Chinese warheads, and North Korea and that proliferation, which has been around for 70 years now. There are endlessly new existential risks which make intelligent people rather skeptical about the trajectory and the value of secular modernity, and more willing now than they were, say, 100 years ago to think respectfully about alternatives. But it probably will take a real catastrophe for people really to wake up. The climate has to get a lot worse. There has to be, God forbid, some nuclear exchange somewhere, the robots take over, something like that, before people think, hey, modernity is out to get us. It's not there to make us more comfortable. But hopefully, scales will fall from people's eyes before we reach that point. But human beings are sheep, and we're not terribly smart, and it's very entertaining, this culture. And people, unfortunately, comatose, hypnotized by it. We hope that they wake up before it's too late.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. Thank you so much. My question is, are you looking into the possibility of training artists and craftsmen to be rooted in the tradition when making their arts, to remedy the ugliness and grim and fear of the things that you just mentioned just a few seconds before this? Thank you so much.
Yeah, everybody's complaining about the ugliness of modernity and of modern art. Islamic art is beautiful. The third most popular gallery at the British Museum now is the Bukhari Gallery. Of course, it has Malaysian funding behind it. It's only third in popularity after the Elgin marbles and the Sutton Hoo treasure. It's always absolutely rammed and full of people. Everybody loves Islamic art. There are various institutions. In the UK, I suppose it's what used to be the Prince's Institute of Traditional Arts, which is now the King's Institute, I think they call it. The Prince of Wales, King Charles, has always been really interested in traditional art, design, gardens, and particularly Islamic versions of those arts and crafts. That's a very good place to study. I don't know what the situation is here in Malaysia, which of course has its own very lovely and distinctive form of Islamic decorative art in particular. But yeah, human beings are sick of ugliness and globalization and the sameness of everywhere. Even in Mecca now, you emerge from the Haram, and there in front of you is the world's most profitable branch of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And it's just kind of, the sameness of it becomes unbearable after a while, and the distinctiveness, the genius of the place and the culture and the language and the narrative. And you always knew where you used to be in the world. Now everywhere is everywhere. And Islamic art, which is not a single thing, but is quite regionally differentiated. As you can see in your Islamic Arts Museum here in Kuala Lumpur, it's a range of artistic idioms. And of course, the oral traditions as well, Islamic sounds, music and so forth, very diverse. Unfortunately, the Muslim world is not really promoting these things. Western countries do. There's a British council here in Kuala Lumpur teaching you English, and they have exhibitions of English stuff, and you hear string quartets from Manchester coming to play you Elgar or whatever, the Goethe Institute, the Alliance Française, the Italians have something. They're all promoting their culture. The Muslim world doesn't do that in the West, unfortunately. So nobody knows. It would be walking through an open door, because these cultures are beautiful and people love them. But unfortunately, we're not really promoting our civilization the way we should.
I'll just have one very, very quick question. Maybe you could just give some sources for this, Brother Ahmad. I'm just going to read part of his question. Do we have sources to combat secularism as a philosophical program? And does CMC has it?
It's interesting, because the traditional Orientalistic or Western Enlightenment polemic against religion has kind of died away with the postmodern end of all narratives and end of all meaning. So the philosophy departments don't really deal with the things that they used to even 30 years ago. That, in a sense, is a victory for theology, but probably theology of the Ghazalian type that assumes that a direct witnessing or mystical experience of the transcendent has to be the basis for the construction of a theological system. Ghazali is very indicative here, because he went through his own kind of almost postmodern crisis of meaning, the interrogation of everything, a kind of medieval sophistry, went through his crisis, but then through his illuminative experience, rediscovered truth. So through the experience of the sacred, theology is founded and supported. For some, the Kalam arguments are sufficient, and the Kalam ontological argument, cosmological argument, kalam discussions of the origin and nature of evil and suffering in the world, are actually, maybe I'm biased, much more persuasive than perhaps more familiar Christian alternatives. And one of the interesting things about the St Andrews online encyclopedia is that you can juxtapose the different religious traditions and what they've said on different levels. Usually, in our context, the Maturidi theology is regarded as having the edge over the Ash'ari theology because of the Maturidi insistence on the autonomous authority of reason in the derivation of logical and ethical judgments. The Ash'ari is much more sort of skeptical, command ethic type of approach, although very often the two kind of interweave. But one of our lecturers, senior lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College, is Ramon Harvey, who's recently published a book about ethics in the Maturidi system, which came from, I think, University of Edinburgh Press. A very interesting contemporary philosophical discussion of some of the Maturidi sort of metaphysical claims. So we are in that space and working on it, although it's neglected. Most Islamic institutions and conferences tend to focus on the Sharia as the solution, or Islamic insurance, or Islamic banking for tomorrow. And those things are fine to discuss. They're not the core religious issues, though, which have been neglected. So one of the things we're trying to do is to get into that kind of hard philosophical space and try and resuscitate them on the basis of kind of dusty and neglected libraries. Yep.
Thank you, Shaykh. Are we going to end? So I've got some housekeeping announcements. You know, the disadvantage of being a moderator is you can never pay attention to the speaker, right? So I have to now go back to the recording and enjoy what Abdul Hakim has spoken. But I do hope that you enjoyed and learned a lot from the Shaykh, and we do hope that the conversation keeps going even after the Shaykh has left within our own society. I think one of the questions that was asked was the absolute versus contextual. And I think the Cambridge Muslim College itself, CMC, is an example of how Islam is being developed contextually within the Cambridge framework, right? As you were saying, that since Cambridge has got all this amazing knowledge base, and also people of knowledge, of the sciences, of philosophy and all that. So Cambridge is using or at least CMC is using the advantage of being within that space and contextualizing the learning within that space. So if there is a way that we can replicate it here, it's not replicate what is Cambridge Muslim College, but replicate the spirit of what CMC is doing here in Malaysia. And I do hope that that will happen with you, and we do hope for collaborations with CMC to help us with that. So now, housekeeping. The surah is on the 8th floor. After this, you can go and pray. There is packed food available for you. If there's not enough, we'll order by Grab and get it to you, right? But I've got to pay for it, so yeah, don't. I hope there's enough. Let's see now. So can we have the, so we're going to do this. And after we give the token of appreciation to the Shaykh, we are going to have another crisis of modernity, which is we've got to take a group photo, right?